because of extraordinary circumstances. This meeting will be conducted by WebEx and will be recorded. Members of the public will be able to monitor this meeting by a special call-in number 855-282-6330 and access code 146-450-6758, password 12345. Make sure you mute if you're not talking so we don't get feedback. Don't use the chat function unless you have technical difficulties. Any discussion should be done verbally so that everybody can be participating even if they're by phone. Make sure you say your name before you speak so that we know who's talking. And we'll have to do everything by roll call because of the electronic nature of the meeting. If you leave the meeting, let us know so that we can make sure we continue to have a quorum. And a video of this WebEx meeting will be posted on the council's website as early as next week. Plans are underway to live stream LUAC meetings going forward starting in 2021. Are there any questions before we proceed? If not, I'll call this meeting to order. It is the meeting of the Land Use Committee for Thursday, November 19th, 2020. And the first item up would be approval of the agenda. Is there any?
Chair,
yes?
Before we do that, can we do a roll call for attendance?
Okay, it doesn't say that on the agenda, but that's fine. Yeah. We can do that. Go ahead and call it.
Okay, we're going to start with Abdi or Sadhu Abdi, John Bodeman.
Present.
Harold Bruner.
Present.
Carl Drotning.
You're muted, Carl.
There we go. I was trying to unmute. I was hitting all the wrong buttons. Present.
Thank you. Jennifer Geisler.
Here.
April Graves. I think I saw her.
I don't see her
Kathy
on the list.
Nope. Kathy Hemken.
Here.
Smiling face, I see that. Noah Keller.
Present.
Philip Klein.
Here.
Trista Maticastillo.
I know she's not here. She has another meeting.
Okay, thank you. Kathy Mokel. I think I saw her.
Here.
Yeah. Steve Morris.
Here.
Mark Nelson. I don't see him. Mitra Jolly Nelson. I probably butchered that name. I don't
see her on the list either.
I don't either. Okay. Dan Rowe.
Here.
And let's see, Courtney Schroeder. No. Vince Workman. I don't see him as well. And Wendy Wolf, of course.
I'm here, and it looks like April joined.
Oh, yep, I see April Graves.
Hello.
Good deal. Okay, we do have a quorum.
Great. Then we will move on to approval of the agenda. Does anybody want any changes to the agenda? Otherwise, we'll just go with it as written. Calling once, calling twice. We're good with our agenda. Approval of the minutes. Are there any changes to the minutes from the September 17th, 2020 meeting?
Motion to approve.
We have a motion. Does anyone want a second?
Hemken, second.
So a motion by Klein, second by Hemken. And Sandy, could you call the roll, please?
Okay, we'll start with Jonathan Bodema.
Yes, I approve.
Gerald Bruner.
I approve.
Carl Drotning.
Aye.
Jennifer Geisler.
Abstain.
April Graves.
Aye.
Kathy Hemken.
Aye.
Noah Keller.
Aye.
Philip Klein.
Aye.
Trista who is not here. We'll move on to Kathy Mokel.
Aye.
Steve Morris,
Aye.
Mark Nelson, you shown up? Nope. Okay, we'll move on to Mitra Nelson. Still not here. Dan Rowe,
Aye.
and I don't see Courtney Schroeder showed up yet. No. Or Vince Workman. Wendy Wolf.
Aye.
Those minutes are approved.
Thank you. Then we move on to our information items. The first one is the tax-based revitalization account, seeding equitable environmental development program. Marcus Martin.
All right, I'm going to start my video here so you can see who I am. I thank you for putting this on your agenda. I hear that you guys like to give out advice, and we could use some of it. So I am the program coordinator for one of the Livable Community Grant programs. It's called the Tax-Based Revitalization Account, as the chair mentioned. And we want to talk in particular today about one of the subtypes of those grants called the Seeding Equitable Environmental Development. I'll just refer to it as a SEED grant from here on out. Next slide, please. So for today, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of tax-based revitalization account for those of you that are not as familiar with them. I will also talk a little bit about place-based equity at the council, and then end with some suggested discussion questions. Next slide, please. So what is TBRA? So TBRA offers financial support for real estate projects that meet public goals. You might be asking yourself, well, what are those goals? Those goals are cleaning up of contamination, increases to the tax base, and adding jobs or affordable housing primarily. Those are the statutory goals. We do have other goals that come from our Regional Development Guide, THRIVE. So what types of sites qualify for TBRA? We work with sites that are contaminated or perceived as contaminated to make them safe for redevelopment. These are often known as brownfields. The most common types of contamination that we deal with are things that are below ground, things like contaminated soils, or things that affect properties above ground. So for example, contaminated soil vapors, influencing kind of indoor air in a building, or things like hazardous building materials like asbestos or lead-based paint. So to be a brownfield is a little bit of a unique niche of an environmental problem. It does require a site, so we don't work with sites that maybe have general environmental issues like non-point issues like exhaust or air quality, just general air quality. We really focus on sites. Next slide, please. So we offer two types of grants. Primarily, these are the basic types. We offer funding for environmental investigation and cleanup. Next slide, please. So let's start with the investigation. So grants for investigation are financial help for trying to find out the type and severity and location of contamination. They're all geared towards getting a plan for the cleanup and ultimately to get a liability assurance. So everything is safe to build on. Next slide. The other, of course, is the cleanup. So once you have that good plan in place, then what we're looking for is offering financial help for removing contaminated, keeping that indoor air safe by mitigating those contaminated soil vapors. We also do some abatement, as I mentioned, asbestos abatement and lead-based paint abatement. And occasionally we do some pre-treating of contaminated groundwater. So that's much more rare. Next slide. So finally we get to the title of the presentation here, the SEED grants. So we have this other category of funding. SEED grants are intended for sites that don't have a planned or identified redevelopment project, and they are located within a current or former area of concentrated poverty. And their applicants are looking for funding for either investigation, a partial cleanup, or both. So when we, go back one, please. Thank you. When we started this category, we started this about 5 years ago. We were interested in having, asking actually how we could projects in areas of concentrated poverty. And folks at that time, they said to us that, we generally don't have the market was one of the common issues, or they would tell us that the projects weren't ready enough to compete. So when we started this, we really had the intent of making the grants easier, particularly early in the development process, and with that goal of attracting other funding, so being early money in. So next, let's talk a little bit about the council's approach to place-based equity. All right, and we will start with kind of equity in general. So for the council, I'm sure you've heard many discussions here about equity this year. But when we're focused on kind of promoting equity, this is how it's defined in our regional development plan, Thrive. So we're looking at using our influence and investments to build a more equitable region. We're looking for creating real choices in how people live and travel, and recreate across race, ethnicity, economic means, and ability. We're also looking at investing in a mix of housing, particularly around transit corridors, and how we do that is also important. So engaging in community decision-making, a full cross-section of the community. So all of the LCA programs, the Livable Communities Act grant programs, are looking at how to better address equity. Next slide. So after, this is a little bit of background history. After defining the regional equity outcome in Thrive, we really started as a council trying to understand that by looking at disparities. So council research identified a lot of regional and racial disparities related to things like employment, home ownership, poverty rates, per capita income, these sorts of things. I'm sure you could name others. So one of the first things that kind of programs, I should say, that responses that came out of that was some HUD funded work. And that was called the Choice, Place, and Opportunity. So that from our HRA. Next slide. So more recently, our research staff has presented kind of on the importance of place and understanding how place relates to disparities, but we're generally rethinking the council's approach to areas of concentrated poverty. And this new approach really looked at the impacts of calling out an area of concentrated poverty that was kind of defined as a deficit-based approach that had negative consequences for some of the neighborhoods or many of the neighborhoods. And so the general suggestions that are being put forward now are kind of collecting more information about the root causes of poverty and taking just more care about balancing tensions between kind of promoting investment in an area of poverty and fueling gentrification or displacement. So those kind of consequences that we didn't intend. So let's switch back and look at kind of how TBRA grants in particular address that. So for this particular category, the SEED grant, how are they impacting equity? Well, they're intended, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, to remove a barrier, in this case, kind of unlike the other TBRA categories, you don't need to have a well-defined project. So the early support was intended to help provide information on environmental needs and costs to kind of overcome those negative perceptions and really kind of get a better sense of what it would take to make more investments. So with that background, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on the types of some questions for you to consider. So this is where I'm going to stop talking, and hopefully you'll be talking more. So our first question, if you'd like, what do you consider equitable real estate redevelopment?
Yeah, Madam Chair.
So, go ahead, Jerry.
My understanding is that when this program was enacted by the legislature, it was designed to get poor families into decent housing. But what I hear from your presentation, what you're supposed to do is identify and clean up hazardous waste, which apparently the goal is then to build on. But I didn't really hear anything. All I heard from you was you seem to put the cart before the horse. So instead of identifying contaminated sites, you're basing your judgments on the level of poverty or something in a given area. Is that correct? Is that how I'm seeing it?
Do you want to take that, Marcus? If you don't, I
will.
can, but.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what we're really, overall, you're correct. For the big picture of the Livable Communities Act program, it was intended as access to a series of grants in exchange for each community setting kind of goals for building affordable housing over a decade. But with this grant program in specific, you really, what we're looking at is you have both. You have to have some kind of a cleanup problem, but we offer those for everyone that participates, every community that participates in the Livable Communities Act, and we've done a lot of them. But for this particular category that we're talking about is we wanted to do even more in areas of concentrated poverty. So we know that they have issues with contamination. That wasn't the issue. It was more the issue was that we weren't getting as many applications as we would like, I should say. We were getting some, but it was not as many as we would like. We probably about a good 30 to 40% of our applications of all kinds are in areas of concentrated poverty already.
Did you have more questions, Jerry, or did that answer your question?
Well, not really. It just seems to me, by definition, you're supposed to identify and clean up hazardous waste. So you don't go out on you don't research like old records to see if some kind of a business was at a particular location, whatever it was that would contaminate soil. You wait to have somebody come to you and want to build somewhere, then you go out and then you investigate to see if the soil is contaminated. Is that kind of how the process works?
So part of the issue, Jerry, is that there's different cleanup standards for different kinds of development. So you need normally to have a plan of what somebody wants to do on the property before you can figure out how much cleanup you need. Like housing needs a better cleanup than a factory or something. So it depends on the land use. But with seed, we've loosened up the standards a little bit to try to get development in places that were struggling. And now we haven't had a lot of applications for this program. So we're trying to figure out, do we get rid of the program or do we need to make changes to make it more usable for people? And so that's why Marcus is here today.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for explaining that. That's a good question. How do you go out and find somebody to give you to let you know they needs to be fixed, cleaned up? I'd have to think on that one before I could answer it. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. So Jenny, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think, Marcus, you hit on the thing that when I was looking at this, that's kind of the catch-22 with it, because if I'm going to clean up an area of poverty, I'm displacing the people that are there. And, how do we make sure that, are we finding maybe adjacent places or things to, you know, clean up sites and get places where these people can move to so you can then clean up the sites? Because unless you're really just focusing on how can I maybe abate, you know, asbestos or lead paint within the buildings and things that they're in, to really clean up the site, you've got to get rid of where they're living, which gets away from the goals of, you know, trying to find affordable housing, and because you're displacing the folks. And so it's almost like trying to do two things, like cleaning up sites and in concentrated areas of poverty. Those are almost in conflict because I can't do both and meet both goals. It's almost like, do I pick what is my intent? Is my intent to improve areas of poverty for the people who live there? Or is my intent to clean up sites so I can get affordable housing in other places, right? That to me is where they're butting up against each other.
Well, thank you for the comment. I think it is something we've been trying to balance. I'll offer that a lot of times the brownfield sites, they're either kind of convert for when it comes to housing, they're often vacant sites or they're converting from something else to housing. So often we're not displacing people on the site itself, but I know that the council research approach is thinks not only about what is happening on the subject property itself, but once something gets built, how do we keep that from, let's say, changing the nature of the neighborhood or the pricing in the neighborhood?
Right.
So I think I saw Carl raising his hand, and Kathy, you unmuted. Are you wanting to speak as well? Kathy Hemkin?
No, I'm good.
Okay, go ahead, Carl.
Thank you, Chair. So can you elaborate a little bit on, I mean, this is pretty much specific to brownfields, if I'm truly understanding everything, and talk a little more about where the brownfields are primarily located, what counties and what areas?
Yes, so brownfields are actually pretty common. They involve a lot of different past uses like that are well distributed, like gas stations, dry cleaning sites, sites that where historic dumping has occurred. So it's pretty widespread, but I would say that the most brownfields are going to be in kind of the central areas, and going out to kind of the first ring of suburbs is probably where the most concentration of industrial properties were, where you have maybe a higher level of contamination than those earlier examples I gave.
Carl, you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, I mean, the areas you're describing are primarily, and this is a tool that's needed. There's no question about that, because the cost of doing some of these corrections is very prohibitive. But primarily, it sounds like not Dakota, but Hennepin and Ramsey County would be those earlier developed areas where a lot of, where you have the creosote plants and some of those kind of things. That's an extreme, but it's more localized toward Ramsey and Hennepin County, and the outlying suburbs may have spotty areas where you referred to the fuel stations and some of those kind of things.
That's generally correct, yes.
And I would follow up with that. Any place that has a historic downtown or an older community before all the pollution laws came up probably has some significant spots as well, like downtown Lakeville, the affordable housing development that's on 210th Street, just east of Holyoke, was a dump, and that was cleaned up in order to put the housing development on there. Phil, did you have a question?
Yes, I did, Madam Chair. Thank you. I guess have you reached out to the developers and asked them what the reason is that those that have declined, why they haven't stepped forward and tried to be more aggressive in trying to get some of these grants? Is it because it's just too too much paperwork to involved. There's too much regulation involved to get it done. And secondly, is this cost prohibitive? It would be to clean up these sites. To what Carl alluded to, this is costly. Is there enough money in this whole program to make it worth their time to even build?
We have had good success with getting developers to respond to our grant programs in general. You do have to have some appetite to tackle those costs, but the grant funds are intended to offset, so it can be financially viable. In this particular category of the seed grants, it really has, the comments have been similar to when we started. People say, well, I'm not sure. We have a market that we're not sure what we would build there. We're not sure about a lot of the activity. And so what a lot of the early applicants have been are, for example, publicly owned sites in areas of concentrated poverty that we can provide some additional information and try to get people interested in buying that site. So we've really kind of tried to lessen the requirements for thinking about that investment in that project to get people to a point where they're more willing to entertain those thoughts. But we just haven't seen as many, particularly in those cold markets. We have seen them elsewhere, just not in the cold markets.
Okay, thank you.
Carl?
Madam Chair.
Oh, he's done. Okay, John, is that you?
Yes.
Okay,
Oh,
we'll let
yeah.
you go first. Go ahead, because
Okay.
Carl's had a chance.
It's hard to ring. I'm not on the net meeting. I'm just on my
Right.
phone, so it's hard to let you know.
And if people want to talk, unmute, because I'm sort of scrolling the list of participants on my screen to see if anybody's unmuting, and that lets me know that you want to talk.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep.
I think this program is really good in that I think we've had discussions in this board on acute environmentalism and addressing it, and some of us feel like that issue kind of loses its place to like more global kind of issues, and there's a lot we can do with acute environmentalism, and I like this program. It helps to solve that issue and then also the housing issue. And the question I would have is, there are a lot of programs, well, it takes care of a lot of needs, like cheap land for one, and access to transportation, access to jobs. So it's what you have thrived for in your Thrive Plan, no pun intended, but or strive for in your Thrive Plan. So have you thought of, there are lots and lots of programs. Is there somebody to kind of be like the tour guide of resources to tap into from like the Met Council's perspective, from a tour guide of the builders, to coordinate some of these other sort of national programs and regional programs with this specific program here?
Marcus?
Thank you for the question. I don't know that we have reached out to, say, builders associations much, but we do communicate more regularly with some of the professional organizations that are already somewhat inclined to take on environmental projects, and those organizations include places like Minnesota Brownfields, the Consortium for Community Developers. We talk to the American Planning Association chapters, the architectural chapters. So we do talk to kind of the related professional organizations, but perhaps not the one that you specify.
Well, the builders are the ones that ultimately build, and they're, a land is a humongous cost, and if there's something that offsets it, I think you got to go to the people who are ultimately going to be responsible for actually doing the stuff. That's just a suggestion.
Sure.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Carl?
Thank you, Chair Wolf. Playing off of your 210th Street conversation, we recently had a single-family development that's basically farmland, where there was an unknown dump that had all kinds of exciting things in there. And I still don't know if the project's going to fly. It's been approved, but they're still working their way through that. But, it's certainly not an area of concentrated poverty. And by no stretch of the imagination, is it going to be affordable housing. That still affects the ability to develop the project because the cleanup becomes a huge burden. I have a feeling that this project, if they were to come in, that wouldn't score very well based on the area of concentrated poverty and the affordability factor and that type of thing. It'd be unlikely they could get funding from this particular source. There may be other ones out there, but this may not be the source.
So we're talking about a subset of the cleanup program right now with the seed program. TBRA in general, you get points for increasing the tax base because it comes from fiscal disparities, and the goal is to get things back on the tax rolls and get housing and jobs and all that kind of stuff going on in the region. So Marcus, you've said before that you have to have kind of a bad mess compared to the overall cost of the project in order to qualify. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So we basically we are looking at often, because all of the sites that we get have some type of contamination problem. We're really comparing those problems and saying, okay, which are the worst problems, and we will prioritize the worst ones first. But we have had a great variety of projects come through. In general, we are looking to be good stewards of the money, and we look to get the most benefits for each grant dollar. So if it's a development that has more, let's say, more units rather, we might prioritize those. But we have funded projects with less density at times. So the chair is correct that this seed category may not be the right one for the project that you have in mind, but we do have some other categories that might be applicable.
Perhaps we should move on to question 2.
Thank you. So question 2 really focuses on this idea of the place-based portion of it. We have this particular category. It really is narrowed down to areas of concentrated poverty. So I want to just ask you all directly if you think we should continue to use that kind of place-based approach for this grant category. Now, we do have equity criteria in just our cleanup grants, our investigation grants. This would be a case where, is this the right approach?
Dan?
I think in terms of both of the questions, what I was going to make a comment on in the earlier part of the discussion was probably more applicable to these questions. I think, probably one of the biggest obstacles that I can see to this program is that the person who controls the land, if it's a private entity, may or may not be thinking about a project. And so they're not thinking in terms of looking for programs to do cleanup or do investigation because there's not that imminence of a project. And that's perhaps where a local authority like a city or an HRA or an EDA can perhaps partner with an existing property owner if a property is identified to be a candidate for this. And since cities typically, or those entities, are the fiscal agent for these types of grants anyway, that can be helpful. The other thing I was going to say is that I think on the place-based approach, it doesn't hurt to have that as sort of a starting point, but it may make sense to say adjacent to areas of concentrated poverty is equally valid, in the sense that I think, especially when you're looking at projects that might create jobs and opportunities, you do want those to be proximate to where people live, and the way that the concentrated poverty is measured is by the residents in that particular census tract. So I think adjacency and use of those areas of concentrated poverty isn't a bad idea, at least as a starting point. But I think, as to the second question on the screen, how do we encourage more? I think it's really reaching out to the entities, the sort of those, non-property owner people who don't necessarily have control of the property, but can make those connections for people that maybe cities have identified certain areas or certain properties that they know are potentially redevelopable over time, but nobody that owns or controls the property has thought about, or no developer has come forward with the project. Certainly, if we can get some funding into those investigations and even some of the mitigations, that certainly makes those properties more attractive for developers, and developers are always looking for that. And then the other piece of it is that might also get the property owner who might have been kind of sitting on the property and not even thinking about doing anything, also thinking about doing something with the property. But I think the key piece there may be working with the local entities.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else? I can't see all your faces at once, so if you want to unmute, I'll look to see who's unmuting. I'm not seeing anybody. April did a chat thing saying she agrees with Dan's comments. In April, we're trying to use the chat only for technical difficulty things so that people can hear, everybody who's just being able to listen can hear. But I read yours off, so we're okay there. But if you can speak, it helps if you do. Anybody else?
Madam Chair?
Jerry.
Yeah, I agree with Dan too, kind of. I think what needs to be done, you need to either say we want to have housing or you want to have businesses. There's nothing wrong with having businesses built in low-income areas, which would provide jobs for people, which would give them, would make it easier for them to live in that area. And a business doesn't, the land doesn't have to be as cleaned up as it would be for housing. So reach out to the business community, and if anyone has something they may want to build, maybe they could build it in one of these areas. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anybody else? Of course, my phone is ringing. If there's nobody else, then you have one more slide that's just your information, contact information, right, Marcus?
Correct. Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's just if you think of something or if you want to talk to me about it later, that's how you can get a hold of me.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your time.
And then next thing on our agenda is the 2021 Livable Communities Act scoring criteria. Tara?
It's LCA and all LCA. I especially feel for you, Councilmember Wolf, because you got almost this exact presentation on Monday. Hello, everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. I think you froze right when you were about to comment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I just was saying that it's important information. I was thinking about that on Monday when I heard it, but it's important for this group to hear it as well.
Appreciate that. Thank you again for having me back. Again, I'm Tara Beard and I manage the Livable Communities Act group at the council. And we've been before you this year and shared that we were doing a lot of kind of high level evaluation of our scoring criteria in anticipation of the adoption of the 2021 scoring criteria for all the LCA programs in 2021. And so this is something we do every year. We adopt the scoring criteria for the next year's grant cycle. But we did do kind of a deeper evaluation this year with me being kind of a new manager, with us having a fairly young staff. We wanted to kind of take stock and really step back and see if there were any overarching and specific kind of scoring criteria issues that we should try to resolve for 2021. So I'm here today to talk about those high level findings around scoring. So we're not going to get into the weeds of specific scoring criteria. That's something that the CDC will be we'll be speaking to the CDC with on the Community Development Committee with on December 21st. So if you're interested in hearing more about detailed scoring criteria, I encourage you to listen in. It won't be adopted on the 21st, so there still will be time for feedback on the specific criteria. But for today, and when we spoke to the Community Development Committee this past Monday, we wanted to summarize some of these higher level changes. So with that, next slide, please. So for today, I'm gonna, I just kind of went over it, but a little bit more about the timeline for adopting 2021 scoring criteria. And I'll just say too that the TBRA programs, which Marcus manages, and you just heard quite a bit about, and then the Local Housing Incentives Account, the LHIA program, managed by Ashley Johnson, those are really focused, well-defined programs in statute. And so they aren't really a part of this conversation today. What we're talking about today specifically is scoring criteria for the Livable Communities Demonstration Account programs, which includes the LCDA program and then the Transit Oriented Development Program. So just putting that out there to be clear. I'll do a quick review of the statutory and policy guidance that tells us how to do scoring criteria determination, results of the evaluation work I mentioned, and then what we're recommending for 2021 scoring criteria, high level for feedback from you all. Next slide, please. So here's that timeline. We went to CDC this last Monday. We're going back on the 21st, and we'll ask for adoption by the CDC on the 19th and the full council on January 27th for 2021 scoring criteria. Next slide. So this is sort of a slide to ground us all in the way to kind of set scoring criteria. So the Livable Communities Act statutes defines these various programs, the Brownfield Cleanup Program, TBRA, the Affordable Housing Program, LHIA, and then the Livable Communities Demonstration Programs. And each of the statutes, the portions of those statutes definitely provide some high level kind of like guidance of the foundational purpose of the program and what types of development projects we should be prioritizing. LCDA projects should connect jobs, services, housing, transit, other amenities and services in a compact, efficient way. That's sort of that high level purpose of the act and the statute. But then the statute also references the Metropolitan Development Guide, which is Thrive MSP, and all of its co-policies like the Housing Policy Plan, co-policy plans, should also inform scoring criteria. And so that's where, you know, we see criteria on things like sustainability or equity, things that are derived from council policies and Thrive, not necessarily things that are mentioned in statute. So those are the things that funnel down into our annual scoring criteria. And the council can also add criteria that aren't necessarily from Thrive or the statute, as long as it's not in, you know, direct contradiction with anything in there. Next slide, please. So with that kind of scoring criteria determination framing in mind, we asked a couple of high level questions this past year to just kind of take stock of where things were at with scoring criteria. We wanted to know, is the scoring criteria clearly linked to statutory guidance and Thrive? Can someone look through the criteria and say, oh, I see this came from statute, I see this came from Thrive? Do the point values in the scoring categories really reflect scoring priorities? And is the scoring criteria well-defined, easy to understand, and objectively measurable? I can't tell you how many amazing scoring criteria we think of that is really, really hard to define, really, really hard to measure. And so, you know, is really not the appropriate scoring criteria until we can figure out those two pieces of it. So next slide, please. So there were kind of two parts to the evaluation activities the LCA team took on in 2020. One was outreach and engagement, and one was our own internal kind of data collection and analysis. And this slide summarizes all of the different outreach and conversations and meetings we've had with various folks about the criteria over the year. Meetings with metro cities and participant city focus groups, so cities that participate in LCA, to talk about some of these higher level questions. We sent out an online survey to participating communities and the development partners that work with them on the applications and development projects that we fund. We've had meetings with you all, of course, conversations with the advisory committee that helps score the second part of scoring for the LCA programs, for the LCDA programs, I should say. Meetings with council staff that score applications. So the first part of the scoring is done with internal council staff. So talking with them about the scoring criteria and any issues they've had with evaluating it. So many ad hoc conversations, and then a handful of meetings with a subgroup of the council entitled the Housing Working Group, or the Housing Work Group, to dive into the scoring criteria as well. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a summary of what we heard that's relevant to kind of the conversation today, this high level, how are we thinking about scoring, and is the scoring organized and clear and easy to measure, or able to measure. So what we heard was that communities with more suburban development patterns, like not fully developed communities that still have greenfields, et cetera, may not feel very competitive. We also heard from smaller communities with less staff capacity that they don't feel very competitive. We also did hear that the criteria is not well defined, and some of it was allowing a lot of subjectivity in scoring. And specifically, that kind of comment tended to connect with the innovation and demonstration criteria, which are not individual criterion, but are actual scoring categories in the programs that we'll look at a little bit later. But those were the two scoring categories that stood out for the most kind of confusion and frustration with feeling like it's really difficult to understand how folks were scored. Some other feedback we got was that the projects, that the scoring criteria looks like we just prioritize everything, and so it's really hard to see clearly what kind of projects we are looking for. Next slide, please. So in addition to that kind of feedback we got, we did some internal work, as I mentioned. And the first thing we did was sort of go through each individual scoring criteria and say, okay, where is there something in statute or Thrive that kind of connects to this, that guides and supports this and helps us know how to measure it? And we really couldn't find any kind of evidence of a statutory or council policy basis for the innovation and demonstration value scoring categories. I've given you sample language from some of the scoring criteria that's within those categories. So you see things like innovation findings, new development concepts, principles beyond a conventional project, being a model. And so, what we kind of saw was a lot of prioritization of the new and the different, rather than maybe what the need is and what the fundamental purpose of the LCA funding program is. And the innovation and demonstration value scoring criterion in 2020 for LCDA was a good 25% of the total score. So this was not just a couple of scoring, points that were available for projects that stood out. This was a really important piece to hit if you wanted to get funding. Next slide. There was also some challenge with understanding kind of the catalyst criteria. There is kind of statutory guidance about promoting private sector development or investment, leveraging private sector investment, which certainly kind of indicates an interest in prioritizing projects that catalyze additional development. But that's one where it's just really hard to measure. And I have before you the two criteria that we have in 2020 to try to measure. And those are both really challenging for us to evaluate in a consistent, measurable way. So understanding the support, the project's ability to support wealth building is challenging, because wealth building is really, at the most simple level, it's going to involve ownership, and very few of our jobs or housing projects are ownership projects. It's a lot of commercial rental space. It's maybe one large industrial project that's one corporate owner and multiple jobs within that, or a lot of multifamily projects, very few of which are ownership. So that became really hard to differentiate projects with. And then looking at catalyzing additional efforts to further community development goals was another criterion that was challenging, because we know enough about the markets to know how they are impacted by so many things. And it's almost like putting so much pressure on one project to sort of be the face of whether or not additional development will spur, when we know that things like things like COVID, things like interest rates, things like, available land, like someone being willing to sell the property next door, can all impact that sort of concept of development begetting development. And if we wanted to just sort of say, well, generally development begets development, well, then that's going to be the case for every project, because every project is a development project by nature of the program. So so Catalyst is also kind of one of the higher level scoring categories we were a little bit unsure of, and that made up 10% of the LCDA total score in 2020, and actually 12% of the TOD total score. Next slide, please. So what else did we learn? We also learned that just in a review of the scoring categories, there were 8 scoring categories each for LCDA and LCDA TOD. Within each category, multiple criteria. I threw a couple examples of the scoring categories for TOD in that first sub-bullet: TOD design, transit accessibility, walkability and ridership, TOD innovation and demonstration. Those are each different scoring categories within the TOD grant program. And so just really, and then within those, we found criterion that were double counted that kind of meant the same thing. And so we just recognized a lot of opportunities to pare down the criterion to be more focused and kind of singular and intentional. We also just know from our own experience that it can be really difficult to provide feedback and technical assistance when we have a hard time showing how our existing scoring criteria translated to a project getting awarded. And that's also a challenge when we get amendments for projects and have to rescore them to kind of be able to go back and understand some of these other old scores on things like catalytic potential or demonstration value or innovation can all be kind of challenging. So next slide, please. So given all that external and internal kind of evaluation, we came up with a couple principles for change to guide some recommendations for 2021. And those principles are clear alignment with statute and Thrive, improved accessibility of the program, both to smaller communities and smaller or new developers, make the scoring methodology easier to understand, and simplify the process in general and remove repetition. Next slide, please. So to that end, we have a couple recommendations for 2021. The first is to remove the innovation and demonstration scoring criteria. And I just want to be really clear that innovation and demonstration value are not bad things at all. And an innovative project doing something new that can teach the region something about what it did is still very likely to be a project that would score very well. It's just that we'll be scoring based on whether that innovation is actually furthering the LCA fundamental purpose versus just, is it new and exciting and cool? So that's our first recommendation. Our second recommendation to try to make that scoring criteria a little clearer is to reorganize it from kind of categories that have sort of been, redlined over the years here and there in kind of a year-to-year way to a really clear framework. So that's three impact-related categories we're proposing. A what? So what is the proposed project impact? How? What is the process being used to develop the project and complete the project? And then who? The project team. Next slide, please. So digging into that a little further, the what or proposed project impact would really be derived from the statutory purpose of the programs and the Thrive policy guidance that we've been given. So, these first 4 sub-bullets are all directly taken from the statute, the Livable Communities Act statutes itself. And then those last 4 are pieces of Thrive, high-level Thrive outcomes that certainly connect and make sense to overlap with LCDA and LCDA TOD projects. Next slide. The how or the project process really prioritizes equitable and meaningful engagement. And some of this criterion existed in 2020. It just wasn't kind of organized in this way. So looking for outreach that is meaningful, looking for development projects that address inequitable development patterns, or at least don't exacerbate them. And really thinking about projects through the lens of who benefits and how much. Next slide, please. And then finally, the who section would be around kind of readiness and capacity, and would look at things like, is the developer team and the applying city, do they have a good process? Do they have a good relationship? Do they both have the ability to further this project? Does the project timeline seem like it could be done within the grant terms provided? And is there something about the team that reflects or is otherwise uniquely kind of responsive to the community served by the project? And that's kind of connected to that. How do we encourage, newer, smaller developers that may not be have been a part of these kind of big grant programs ever before? And so really trying to value and prioritize projects where maybe someone from the community itself is a part of the proposal. Next slide. So that's my really, really fast kind of walkthrough of what we've been doing over the last year in terms of kind of a big picture, high level LCDA and TOD scoring kind of philosophy or principles to kind of move forward with. So we expect kind of a different look for 2021 of the scoring criteria, but we definitely want feedback on if this actually would help. From your perspective and what you've heard today, would it help you better connect our programs to Statute and Thrive? Or is there other information that would be really useful for us to better clarify what we're prioritizing in the projects that we fund? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Would anybody like to comment? If maybe we keep the questions back. I can see all your faces when we take the questions away, but then you guys see what the question is if they have taken it away. So if you want to unmute, if you want to talk, or we'll keep the questions up so you know what the questions are. Why don't we do that? And so far, I'm not seeing anybody unmuted except for me.
Madam Chair?
Jerry.
Yeah, I found it fascinating that I think you made the comment that every year you change the criteria. Doesn't that kind of make it kind of hard for people to have consistency in these programs? And, if the rules and things change every year, doesn't that make it much harder for people to apply for these things? Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll listen.
Tara, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jerry, thank you for the question. We certainly don't start from scratch every year. And I don't want to imply that a good chunk of criteria that's been used for years doesn't come from Statute and Thrive, because it does. There's a lot of solid criteria that we're carrying over that is still, so again, that foundational purpose of compact connected development that connects jobs, housing, and other services and amenities, that's always been like the foundation of the scoring criteria. But every year for the next year, council adopts that coming year's criteria. And so what's often happened are, lessons learned, things getting tweaked, realizing, okay, this criteria was not differentiating projects for us at all. We're not sure it's very helpful. The market has changed. We've heard this from this community that this type of cost is no longer something that, that needs to be financed. We heard that about the nature of kind of funding solar panels or something like that. So when I say we adopt it every year, it's not like a full scale start from scratch, but more of a kind of tweaking.
Anybody else?
Yeah, thank you, Tara, for that.
You're welcome.
Madam Chair?
Phil? That sounds like
Yes.
Phil.
Yes, it's Phil Klein. Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question would be is, we know currently what has been successful and what works. Why not stick with that and just increase the ability for those folks to work within those guidelines? I'd have to agree with Jerry to some degree, because if we're changing it all the time, I think it makes it more difficult to understand what's going on. I think it would be advantageous to keep things simple, and let's work with what really works and expand those positives of the program.
Madam Chair?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I would hope that that is exactly what we are doing. So in removing kind of the demonstration value and innovation kind of chunks of scoring, we're significantly reducing the number of criteria folks have to try to account for in their application. And we're reducing a lot of the, again, more subjective kind of comments on projects that are differentiating them in a way that doesn't connect to any of our policies. So we are definitely trying to simplify things. And I do think also our analysis, both external and internal, really kind of revealed that there's a couple parts aren't working very well. And so we're trying to address that, just sort of the geographic diversity of where applications come from and where awards go was telling us a lot about kind of the same folks getting get applying year after year, and the same folks tending to get funded, certainly with some exceptions. So I think that these changes we're proposing today are fairly conservative, given kind of thoughtful consideration of feedback we've gotten and analysis that we've done. But again, the remaining criteria it will be organized slightly differently, but a lot of the criteria you will see is the same well-working criteria that folks are used to and have seen as a part of the scoring criteria in the past.
Does that answer your question, Phil?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you, Tara. Thank you.
And unfortunately, by having this a little bit shorter for you guys, we missed the slides that show how many of the grants were going to the same places, and so a lot of places weren't applying at all. So I heard Carl's voice and somebody else. Was that Kathy?
Jenny.
Okay, Jenny, then Carl.
Okay. So thanks, sir. So from my perspective, I think clearing up the scoring criteria is great. And I think just making sure that everybody understands what that criteria is. The tie back to the statute and Thrive, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if many developers actually care. So that I think is important for us to know why we're promoting it and having the scores, but I would leave that out of any other conversations for people who are applying, because they just want the money and the grant. And as long as we're having them do the things that we want, and then just make sure that as you get that scoring criteria done, take your best projects, run them through, and make sure they score well.
Madam Chair, if I could just respond, I think you're exactly right, and that's exactly what we're going to try to do. We thought it was a really important internal exercise to evaluate the criteria and how it connected to statute or to policy, but that doesn't need to be anything, that doesn't need to be in the forward-facing documents at all. And absolutely a part of our evaluation process, especially for some of the specific criterion tweaks that we looked at, involved going to applications from this year that scored really high and seeing how they'd score if we had tweaked that, and just making sure that those sort of changes had the intent we were hoping for. So thank you. That's reaffirming that you had those suggestions.
Carl.
Thank you, Chair. When I read the agenda and looked at the notes, I was really excited to hear what you presented tonight, because it looked a lot like I felt, and I feel very, very good that, quite honestly, you're cutting out some fluff and stuff that encourages a bunch of smoke and mirrors, and it's almost impossible to really measure. So yeah, it may feel good, it may sound good, but you're setting the fluff aside and doing the business of business. And I really like that. And I think it's a great improvement. I'm very, very supportive of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Madam Chair.
April.
Yeah, I'm wondering about if you still feel like, sort of the intent behind those two other buckets of innovation and demonstration are still reflected in those three what, how, and who questions. I'm also wondering if you feel like any of those three are at all conflicting. Primarily, I'm thinking about the how and the who in small businesses or small developers within that, and whether or not the scoring is still going to be reflective of the importance within those new buckets. I hope that made sense.
Madam Chair, thank you. Yeah, I think so. I'll take a stab, and then please let me know if I didn't cover it, cover your questions and hopeful feedback. I'll start from the end and work backwards because it's fresher in my head. I think the intent, at least with the how and the who, is that the how is looking outward. So how does the development team or the city, you know, how is the community included in the project development and the kind of definition of the need for the project, and looking at who is going to benefit from the project. And that criteria is definitely explicitly connected to, you know, equity, and making sure that, you know, inequitable development patterns and practices, you know, that we're looking for projects that are trying to lean into making sure that they aren't doing that. And then the who is more internal. So who is the project team? You know, one of the criterion is about kind of the city and the developer's relationship, because frankly, one of the more kind of common reasons we see projects relinquish funds after they've been awarded, or projects not go as well as we'd hoped, is because the relationship between the development team and the city who applied on their behalf, you know, is not kind of well communicated, developed, is not developed well. And so the who is really trying to get at that internal team, you know, who's going to be submitting draw requests. Has the city, you know, the city may have participated in the sense that they helped apply, but did they also offer funding toward the project? Like, what's that degree of city support? The how is really about how did you engage the community? So that's the intent between the two sections. And then, of course, I've completely forgotten your first question. I apologize. Could you repeat it?
It was more around like the scoring, the changes in, you know, because you were talking about the percentage that those other buckets were worth within the scoring. And so I'm wondering how that's reflected with these new criteria.
Thank you. Got it. Yes, that is definitely more of an in the weeds question that we're still kind of developing for that December 21st conversation. But I would say that one of the, you know, I can share that some of the things we looked at is if you look at the statutory language and this idea of housing, jobs, connectedness, and kind of compact development, those really are the four core tenets of the statute. And so I spent a lot of time looking at, I've been spending a lot of time looking at kind of what were the total points available for housing in 2020. And when I think about removing the demonstration or the innovation criteria, you know, and we can either make those points just sort of go away, or they could kind of be reallocated into other sections, just thinking about kind of, okay, what are criteria that are from the foundational purpose of the program versus criteria that are valued and priorities of the council, and kind of thinking about scoring, you know, being most impactful at that foundational piece, and then moving, you know, in the direction of certainly can impact your final score, but isn't sort of like the hugest section of points. Would be things that are like, yep, we really want to see these things. This is valuable to us for these reasons, but the foundational purpose is where the meat of the scoring comes from. And I think, if I can, I'm remembering more of your first question kind of around, you know, are we losing anything maybe, you know, in the demonstration and innovation piece? And I think that is a great observation and question, and I really take that to heart. I will be totally frank with you. There are some members of the Livable Communities Advisory Committee that help score that feel very strongly that innovation and kind of above and beyond unique projects should be the focus. But I think there is kind of a confusion between high quality projects and really exciting, you know, kind of new looking kind of projects, if I can say so. And, you know, I've heard feedback before, and this project is just kind of a suburban, you know, a 90s suburban design. And I don't disagree with them, but I just can't find any kind of policy direction to support factoring that into two projects, that one had an architect that went with a more modern design and the other didn't. So when I talk about kind of the design, you know, we definitely want to keep the pieces of the criteria that encourage really good functional design, you know, connectivity, pedestrian experience, those kinds of things. What we want to stay away from is criteria that allows for differentiation in kind of aesthetic design, because that's when we start to get really subjective, right?
I'm sure.
Who was that? Dan?
Dan, yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to echo that. I think that what we saw in our approach in Roseville, where we went away from, it's sort of an analogy to this. We went away from having what are called planned unit developments in our zoning code. We didn't want to. It seemed like everybody was shoving things into the planned unit development category that just simply didn't meet our zoning, and so we were getting, you know, projects that were not really meeting our objectives, and so we completely got rid of them. And then when we brought them back in, we said, well, we're going to say you can do a planned unit development that, seeks certain exceptions from certain zoning requirements, but it has to achieve a certain goal that we want as a community that we've outlined in our, sort of foundational documents or vision documents. And this sounds very much like that, where you're not just saying the innovation is for the sake of innovation, but it's perhaps an innovative way to achieve one of the objectives that's in the statute or in Thrive or other documentation of the council. And I think that makes very much sense to do. So I'm appreciative of that. And then the second thing I wanted to comment on the who category is talking about, are there criteria in terms of trying to get away from maybe the same 5 usual suspect developers doing all the projects in the metro area, bringing in more diversity of developers and more, across, and giving opportunity to people that might not otherwise have a chance to get into this type of work and can do a good job and have a good relationship with the community, but maybe aren't the top 5, type of developers out there.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
That's super exciting to hear that question. Thank you for the earlier feedback. And what you just described is on our plate for deeper evaluation in 2021. So I think that definitely keeping the scoring criteria clear and well-defined and measurable is key to making it accessible. But what we have to do more than that. And we have to do more than that in terms of how we run the program and how we do outreach for the program. And so we have a lot of evaluation questions next year, very specific to how we make these programs more available to less common development partners, including, conversations with the Center for Economic Inclusion and, various equitable development scorecard kind of processes out there that, like, the scoring criteria for LCAs kind of dabbled with and then backed away from and then not quite hit the right note with before. So, I would say please stay tuned, and I wouldn't be surprised if there would be a LUAC presentation along those lines next year, because we plan to spend some time focusing specifically on how to encourage new, smaller, less traditional developers to be a part of applicant teams. And there are people working on this in the region right now. LISC is working on it. There's another organization that's eluding me right now that's working on kind of like small developer mentorship programs, smaller developers with larger developers. So we're really going to kind of shake every tree and look under every rock and see kind of the right role for us to play in supporting that.
Great, thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Anybody else?
Chair Wolf?
Yes.
I'm going to piggyback on what Dan said a little bit.
You got to say you're Carl so that they have.
Hi, I'm Carl. Well, yeah, usually will recognize me by name, so I.
Well, I wasn't sure who it was. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry too. But I'm piggybacking off of what Dan said. Local ordinance define a lot of the architectural issues that projects can or can't do. The other half of that is also, to your point, Dan, the PUD has been sometimes a license to steal, and many communities have found that to be true and are working hard at trying to tighten those things up a little bit. So the innovation thing is so subjective, and they still have to go with the local ordinances. We just had a proposal come in that didn't meet the ordinance, but we played with the words to where we didn't have to do a CUP or a PUD. We changed a couple words in the ordinance, and it made it a living, breathing, and the ordinances are living, breathing documents. So just like the criteria that you're using, it's going to continue to evolve based on the experiences that you have, which is why, number one, I applaud what you're doing. And number two, the innovation factor, if it's a shiny new type of material that may be really neat right now, but 5 years from now, it's junk because it's got issues, let's stick with something that's easily measurable. I think what you're trying to do, that's what you're trying to do.
Anybody else?
Madam Chair?
April?
Yeah, just to be a little bit more clear, Dan kind of helped me clarify my thoughts. One thing I was thinking about between that how and who is maybe a little bit of a disconnect, because if we're thinking about smaller developers, they might not have the capacity or the infrastructure in place to have those relationships that you were talking about with city staff. So I'm just thinking about, if somebody might meet the requirements within the WHO because they're smaller, they're more connected to community, but because of that, they don't have that how as much in place. And so I just wanted to highlight that in the form of like providing maybe some additional TA around building that capacity.
Madam Chair, thank you. That's great advice. And I think something we're going to try to focus on definitely with TA and also with our pre-development funds. So how do we do a better job of making our pre-development funds available and folks aware of them so that they can use them to do some of that outreach if they're not a, well bankrolled developer that has money up front to kind of provide a lot of engagement. So thank you. It's a great point.
So Tara, what is TA?
Oh, I apologize. Technical assistance.
Thank you.
So when we say do great, meaningful community engagement, and then we just say, but you figure it out on your own. We don't want to do that. So, we want to provide more information, like what is the demographic information of the project area or the city that the project is in? There could very well be developers that didn't know there was, a large Karen community not very far away, or, et cetera. So, we have a lot of great, talented people in community development at the council who not only themselves, but know of organizations that can really help connect people to engagement opportunities and other types of opportunities. So again, not just the scoring criteria, but even in how we communicate and practice and operate the programs, we want to really try to open it up.
Thank you. John, were you wanting to say something?
Yeah, I just want to comment, if that's okay, Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to applaud you for focusing on the mission, which is, everybody here knows that there's a housing shortage, particularly in low income housing, and it frustrates me I'm kind of an outsider here, and I can obviously you all know that they're really the Met Council isn't loved and adored everywhere in town. And so it kind of pains me to hear that some people are advocating new innovation on a committee rather than focusing on the task at hand, which is getting the housing stock up, it sounds like, or it seems like. And I'm glad that you're having them address that issue. And I also want to say, if we have a housing shortage, and we talk about this in council all the time, you can't start limiting who gets what. I think that the housing shortage is probably the biggest issue that I see from press of the Met Council, and particularly low-income housing. And I would caution against trying to do so much, and this is one of the irritations that I have. It's like everything the Met Council wants to accomplish when it comes to this, in particular, has to be the finest bows with the small builders and minority owned and in certain areas. And it's frustrating because that's not going to get if you got to focus on one thing, and that's to get houses built. And I think the Met Council loses focus on that because they try to fill all these different criteria that they have. And so I would prefer that new designs get put away, or effective designs are the most important thing. And who builds them? I would say until we're caught up, or it's not an issue, we've got to get big builders to build big projects, because little builders aren't going to fill the bucket that we need here. That's my 2 cents worth. I appreciate you focusing the group on the important things, and I think that's good. It's refreshing to hear for me, who can be skeptical of some of this. So thank you.
Does anybody else want to say anything? Going once, going twice. Is that your last slide? You have like one more information slide of how to contact you, Tara, or you're muted.
There it is. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. So everybody's encouraged to watch the meeting on December 21st. It will be streamed live, and you can also watch it later if you have something to do that day. And then anything you have in the way of thoughts about the actual scoring criteria and numbers that Tara presents that day, you are welcome to email her or call her and give her a piece of your mind about whatever you think about so this is your opportunity to have direct input in the process on the actual numbers too. Just because we aren't having a second presentation because we don't have a meeting in December doesn't mean that you can't participate and give Tara a piece of your mind, or me, about what you think about when she comes out with the actual criteria and the numbers. So please take time to participate in that so that you can be part of the decision. Any other questions before we go on to the next thing, or comments? Somebody's got a barking dog. Okay, thank you, Tara.
Thank you all so much.
And we will go on to the next item, which is the Economic Value Atlas introduction. Dan Markell and Joel Hudding.
Good, let's see, at this point, good almost evening, Chair Wolf and committee members. My name's and I'll be taking the bulk of the presentation today. Joel Hudding is on reserve, so if things get dicey, he'll jump in and save the day, as well as a number of other people on the call as well. I am here to present this project that is getting started, and it's a very early presentation. I'm here for a couple of reasons. One is to just let you know this is going on, and to get any ideas you have or find out how you might want to be involved in it as it goes forward. The project is called the Economic Value Atlas, which I'll explain as we go through here. And this is a tool that's intended to support the kinds of discussions that were referred to in Tara's presentation. There was a lot of discussion about how do you measure certain things? How do you ask questions that you can actually show some data on? This tool, to some extent, is intended to make it easier for folks. Next slide. I can see my notes. So we'll be talking about what is the Economic Value Atlas, why are we doing it, who's involved in it, and then have a discussion about what kind of opportunities LUAC wants to pursue with it. Next slide. Think of this as two different parts that relate to each other. The big product that we're working toward is an online and interactive tool that gathers data so we can bring feedback into discussions about both our land use and our infrastructure investments in the region. We're intending to be able to use it for various council processes and for general information. But it's essentially an organized access to a bunch of data in one place. That's the cool tool that we're working on. Underlying that tool, however, foster shared understanding and decision-making that supports regional values. So as we all know,
can you hold up a second, Dan?
Oh, certainly.
Is anybody else having some audio difficulties with Dan, or is it just me?
I am as well, Chair. This is Sandy.
Okay, maybe if you shut off
too.
your video, Dan, your
Okay.
audio will come through better.
All right, I'm going to do that. I'll repeat a little bit of what I just said. I'll repeat a little bit of what I said, and let me know if it's still a problem, and I'll talk slower, I guess, or less. Maybe less is a better option. So there's two parts to the Economic Value Atlas. One is an online tool that collects, that gathers a bunch of data that we have, existing data, and puts it in one portal so we can have data feedback about discussions we have at the council, like what kinds of investments should we make? How do we compare those things? This is intended to be a portal sharing back and forth. The second part of the project, however, underlies that. It's an engagement process and a discussion process to foster shared understanding and decision making, so we can express our regional values that then get shown in the data that we put in the portal. How's my sound doing?
Much better.
Okay. Well, I'm sort of glad you don't have to watch me the whole time then. Next slide, please. This is a project, the Economic Value Atlas. There's actually a version of this that exists right now. In 2018, 2019, there was a partnership between the Brookings Institution and Portland, Oregon's Metro that piloted a version of this. And similar to this one, it provides a data picture, just the alignment between planning, infrastructure, and economic development. The work that we're doing right now follows on this as kind of version 2.0. At the bottom of the slide, you should not be able to read those words, but there are links to that tool. It's just called the EVA tool Oregon Metro, and if you put any of those into Google, you'll get to the thing. But you can see kind of how it works if you're of interest to look at that. Next slide. This is just a little closer view in, just one screenshot from that tool from Portland. And I just want to point out the different parts of it that you can expect to see for our metro area in about a year and a half. In the middle of the screen, obviously, is a big map of the region, their region, Portland. But on the left-hand side, we can start to look at what kind of data they put together. And I did this right off of their tool and took a screenshot. They bundled their data into 3 big groups: information about business, information about people, and information about the place. And the interactive part of this tool comes when you click on those various triangles and you see more options available for measurement. Down at the bottom on the left is a little more explanation of the measurement. On the right-hand side of the screen is kind of the results if you choose the various options. So on the right is outputs, on the left is inputs, and in the middle it's neatly mapped so we can all see it to compare things. Our EVA, we're looking at envisioning something similar in this region. Next slide, please. So as I said, we are working on a kind of version 2.0 of this. There are 3 regions that are working on this 2.0. Us, Met Council, Mid-America Regional Council, which is around Kansas City, and then Portland is also still in the mix. Each of these places is doing a slightly different version of it, but it's the Brookings Institution sponsoring this discussion, and their vision is really to pilot this and potentially, if it's a good platform, share it more broadly, share the sort of open source coding that we're working on. And so that treads into a lot of the details of the thing, but which I won't get into now, except unless we get there in discussion. Next slide, please. So what in the heck would we use this thing for? I mean, we do like to map things. We do like to have our data in order. But what we're excited about is that we have a chance to put a bunch of data together and have a portal where we can use to evaluate different things that the council gets involved in. So this could be used for regional solicitation for transportation funding. If we clicked on the right measures in that screenshot I showed you, you'd be able to find out a report of what are the economic characteristics of the folks who live in the census tracts in an area. It's to compare different potential transportation funds. We just had 2 presentations about the Livable Communities program, and there was quite a great discussion about what are we measuring? Can people understand what the program's about? Is it clear how it relates to things? We do envision using this for evaluating livable communities proposals, among other things. So there's an example just from the discussion today. Those are external uses. We also see using this to inform council operations, particularly in transit, regional sewer, and some of the other internal things that we get involved in. Just a single data source for a lot of good things. And this next one is something that I'm particularly interested in and working on, and it's to provide a data platform so that we can easily explore the implications of different policy options in the next regional plan. So Thrive is for 2040. We're at the very early stages of thinking about the 2050 plan, and the Economic Value Atlas is a chance for us to have some data underlying a lot of the discussions for that plan. And then finally, we do envision this being kind of fully available for anybody to use as a data source. We can imagine cities using it, or community groups or nonprofits or other folks using the information. The idea is open source and open availability of data that we have. Next slide. Kind of a collection of folks involved in this effort. This effort does follow on the project that was called the Regional Economic Framework. If you recall, or if you knew about it, there was something called the Regional Economic Framework that was adopted over the summer, and it essentially had a sort of proto version of the discussion about our economic values in our region. That does exist. It's adopted by the council, but it's really for use in accessing federal funding. We're going to start where that discussion left off in talking about values. And Met Council staff will be involved in it, Met Council committees, advisory committees such as yourself, the council itself will be involved in it. We're also working with Greater MSP and the Center for Economic Inclusion, who were involved in the Regional Economic Framework. Brookings Institution sits in there as well as a partner. And then there's a whole bundle of folks we talk about as regional partners who would be interested, and potential users and potential participants in creating the thing. And then there's the final category there, stakeholders, folks who would be impacted by this or might be interested in it, but they don't want to spend a lot of time sitting in meetings with us and doing coding. So that's the kind of range of participants that are involved. Next slide. Here you can see the steps that are going to happen kind of over the next year and a half. We've been doing project planning and starting to identify how to go about doing this. We had a meeting with the various other regions, but really now is when we're kicking off the big effort. We're going to be finalizing who we think our stakeholder partnerships are, who our partners are, but that under Winter 2020, the second rectangle, I guess I'll call it, draft the regional economic values and measures. There will be a kind of engagement process with a lot of people to refine what we consider our regional economic values and how we measure those values, which gets into the data and all sorts of fun things. That's going to be a primary effort coming up here in the winter. So you might, if you're interested in this work, you might want to pay attention for joining in that discussion. And then there's a big bunch of work about collecting and organizing data, beginning software coding. We're presuming that we're going to be doing this with open source coding so that we can share efforts with other regions. And it's a kind of next generation of website tool for the council. I won't read the whole thing through you, but the sort of ends sometime in 2022. So we'll be going over the next year, starting to test things summer, fall, and then implementing, being able to use it really in 2022. Next slide. So this is the discussion part. I get to quiet down a little bit. The questions we really have for you are, what questions come to your mind? What potentials do you see? I like the word lurking, so I put, do you have any lurking concerns at this point? And more specifically, what role would you like to play? We're happy to come back and just report on this. We're happy to include you highly as a group, as individuals. And I just wanted to use one example, since we do have a focus in equity in the council. How does the economic value atlas relate to equity? In a number of ways. The values discussion that I talked about is a chance for us to underpin a shared approach to equity. What do we mean by it? How do we measure it? The tool, because it's reported in this similar format, it puts equity data on the table with other measures that are more frequently used. It helps explain it's intended to help explain what we mean by equity and compare things. Tool results can help compare the equity performance of alternatives. So there was quite a discussion in Tara's presentation about what does a given proposal actually achieve. We could measure, we could evaluate two different proposals in the Livable Communities program for how they vary by equity performance. So it's kind of a conceptual discussion at this point, but I welcome your thoughts, and I'm going to take a drink of water and look forward to what you have to say.
So who would like to go first?
Madam Chair.
John.
Yes, I have a question. It's $1 million question. How much is the project going to cost?
I am going to, sorry, hang on one second. We are using existing staff time for this project. There's not envisioned to be a huge amount of excess costs beyond what's already spent as staff time. This is largely a process of organizing existing data, the coding parts of this. We have the skills
Coding
largely in-house.
You're going to code in-house?
This is the case where I'm going to see if Joel wants to weigh in on this, because he's been thinking about this a lot. The folks in
I can weigh in, Dan. So yeah, we have several data scientists on our team that code these type of tools as part of their regular jobs, and it's certainly within our wheelhouse to build it. We're planning, most of the costs will be internal. I could imagine there might be some costs associated with the outreach and engagement efforts, but that's probably pretty trivial.
Internal costs are still costs.
Right. I'm not saying that those are not costs. I'm saying that our outreach and engagement costs are relatively trivial. Something like something less than $5,000. But that's true. I'm saying we're not spending any additional money other than staff resources. There was actually a McKnight grant that I believe is paying some of Brookings' expenses as they sort of facilitate this process. But the council is not putting in additional money besides engagement costs. And beyond staff resources.
Does Brookings get paid?
Yeah, I believe Brookings is paid through a McKnight grant.
The whole thing. I'm just asking because I do a lot of data mining, and I see this data, and you can find it other places. You just got to be willing to look or have a favorite spot designated on in your computer. You can look up all this data, and the subjectivity of what defines whatever you had said about economic activism or some sort of metric. It makes the data not data, it's subjective evaluation of the data. I have a hard time with justifying, and there have been like 3 projects of data commingling that have come before us in the last few years, and I don't like them. I think they're a waste of time, and they take energy away from whatever it is we're trying to do, like the program we just talked about. A lot of positive energy, a lot of positive outcome. I think everything that you've proposed can be done. You can grab it on your own. I mean, if you want honest feedback, I assume you do. I think it's a waste of time and money, and I think it can be better spent other places that have more effective, measurable results.
Thank you for that input. And I did verify that the Brookings portion of this is covered entirely by McKnight.
Thank you, John. We are
Yeah.
asking for honest feedback, so I'm glad that you're being candid about your thoughts.
Well, on the city council level, we wouldn't use it, and I don't. Yeah, we just when we're trying to find some data, we find the data, and we use it. And I don't know. It seems like a redundancy issue to me. But I'll let other people chime in. Yeah, carry on. Go ahead.
Madam Chair?
Harry.
Yeah, Joel or Dan, it's for either one of you. Please tell me that this is another level of bureaucracy here at the Met Council. I think I agree with the gentleman who just spoke a little bit. It seems like it's awful kind of redundancy. What's here, but maybe if you want to clarify things for me, my concern there, I'd be glad to hear it.
Sure. Chair Wolf and committee members, thank you for the healthy skepticism, which I do appreciate because we're at the inaugural part of this. I think what you'll find is the kinds of uses that we're talking about making with this of this tool, their work that is already being done inside the council, inside counties, inside whoever's working on these projects, but they are done one by one by one by one by one, and a lot of people are creating parallel data. They're duplicating efforts in putting data together. The promise here, or the hope, is that by talking to all those folks who are currently doing the kind of data mining that we're talking about, we can make a source that saves time from all those individuals having to go about it. And that's that's kind of one of the, I guess, precepts that we're working with.
Is that all you had to say, Dan?
And I'll stop there. Over.
Okay. And does anybody else want to provide some input or ask questions?
Chair Steve Morris.
Go ahead.
I would just echo the previous two council members or LULOC members and say that this appears to be a little bit redundant. As I looked at I looked at that screenshot of the Portland and thought that was very interesting. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that has spent some time on the census sites and using the census tools that are available out there. And I just written down a note to myself that I remarked that it looked oddly similar in ability and data points that it was pulling to. And I have no doubt to one of the other members had said that the data is out there. You just got to go looking for it. And again, I would again reiterate, what exactly are we going to use this for? And the purpose of it, nice to have, but necessary. Staff time is expensive. And what are we going to be getting into from a necessity of what we're going to be using this for, or what could be used for? And so I again I would reiterate and also say if this came to my council for a vote, I'd be a strong no, and not necessary. And there's additional information that the information is available in other means and very useful tools, for example, the census. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody
else? Is that Carl?
Carl? Yeah.
Go ahead, Carl.
Well, and in business, we love assembling information and using data, but we're doing it primarily to find something that's actionable. And so I think it's important that whatever the outcome is here, we have to have actionable information, but it has to be objective. And that's where it was alluded to earlier. You can end up with some very subjective approaches, or what's the accounting phrase? Numbers can lie and liars use numbers. So it's very, very difficult to look at something like this and say, how is this going to be objective, and how is this tool really going to be used? And maybe I missed something in the presentation, but it has to give us something, the council, something that is truly actionable. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Anybody else?
Chair, this is Jenny.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, I think reiterated a lot of the different things. And when you look at your steps, where the creation of the use cases is after you're beginning the application, to me, it's who really are the users, and do they have access to this data elsewhere? And if they do, then it's really not necessary. And if this is to find a niche for that unique set of users that don't have access to that other data, there needs to be, what is that benefit, for those users, or how can we teach them to use the data that's already there?
Thank you. Anybody else? I was trying to kind of multitask, and I'm clicking on the little map that you get if you click on the link that Dan gave us, and I'm not altogether sure how it would be useful, any different from other data is out there as well. If you could, if Dan or Joel want to say something about how they think this would actually make a difference, that's fine. If other people want to give their opinions, I don't want to exclude anybody from being able to chime in.
Sure. Chair Wolf, committee members, I really honestly do appreciate the cold, harsh light of the LUAC committee. I'm glad you were paying attention so closely, because we are at the beginning of this project, and to make the cost benefit case or the use case is certainly advice well taken. As we look at what Portland talks about as the benefits that they got from it and the particular uses they got from it, they talk a lot about the shared regional discussion they all had about how are we going to evaluate what our major infrastructure investments are. How are we going to put numbers to the different ideas for what we do in our region? And so, even though it's a technical reporting tool, they kind of emphasize the shared discussion and decision-making part of it as well. So if I think about things like the regional solicitation process, there's a set of measures that are typically used to evaluate projects. This would allow a more integrated relationship between things like access to markets or labor sheds, and the what it does for our equity performance in the region. So that's exactly what that track of the project is for, the decision-making track or the policy value-making track. And we take your advice about what's being provided that doesn't already exist, and what's the value proposition here? That's great feedback. It may seem blindingly obvious to you, but it's a kind of it's a kind of cold light of day thing that I really appreciate.
So,
and we will work on.
Thanks, Dan. As I'm looking at it, it looks like it just tells you census data about different areas of the region on different measures. Is that what it does?
Go ahead, Joel, is that you?
Yeah, Chair Wolf. Well, census data is certainly a part of it. There are a lot of other data sources, and there would be some data development involved. And the first step of this is first to define those economic values, and then define how those are going to be measured, and then start to potentially develop the data sources for that, which, yes, a lot of them would likely come from the Census Bureau. The idea is mashing up all this information about place so that you can look at any individual place on a map and in one consolidated location, be able to see how all these factors come together. That is not a tool that exists in the region. It's absolutely true that you can go out and you can collect census data, you can collect some of these other factors, and you can develop the data set yourself, and you can do your own analysis. There's no doubt about that. But mashing them all up in one tool that you can just click on a census tract and see all the relative strengths of that census tract in all these different dimensions in a really quick consolidated way, and potentially even have some additional clustering algorithms on there that kind of show unique places that would be well tailored for certain types of investments. Having all that information in one tool in one place, I think, has the potential to be a powerful tool for the region.
Okay, thanks. I guess I'm not seeing it. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at all of the different sorts of factors in our region. And when I look at a project, I'm more concerned with what the project itself is going to do. And I mean, I understand the underlying data about the region, but I'm more looking at the proposal, not necessarily worrying totally about what the demographics of the place it is in, but more what does the project itself do. Does anybody else understand what I'm saying or think the same thing? Or
Chair.
Who's speaking?
Sorry, Steve Morris.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I'm Chair. I'm exactly 100% with you. Is that when we just spent a considerable amount of time earlier talking about the Livable Communities Act and the criteria and what it's looking at and how do we layer that on, and I couldn't help but think of throughout the presentation of we really are in the midst of a solution looking for a problem kind of a scenario here, which is what good government does, right? You know, but certainly, you know, at what expense, which is the earlier thing. But again, with you, so much work at a city, county, and Met Council level is done project by project. I even through that last explanation, which I think was a great explanation by Dan, I still thought that we were in a solution looking for a problem kind of a scenario. So I 100% agree with you, Chair.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in before we move on to the next thing? We're just about out of time.
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. I'm with Steve. I agree with what you said completely.
Okay. Well, I don't know that it's what you wanted to hear, but you got your feedback, Dan. If anybody, and Joel, if anybody wants to email any more to them, feel free to do so. And thank you for your presentation.
Chair Wolf and committee members, thank you. My contact information flashed briefly on there. That was not at my doing.
Well, but it is in the agenda. If people pull up the PowerPoint, they can get it from there too.
We're going to take your advice, go back and sharpen our computer mouse and work on this. So thank you very much for all the input.
Thank you. Okay, so the next up thing is the
Chair?
Yes.
If I could briefly interrupt. This is Deb. I believe I saw Swato Abdi in on the meeting. If you could just ask to confirm that for the minute.
I saw her for a second, but then I think she left again.
Oh, did she?
Yeah, I saw has left the meeting. I didn't see when she came in, but I did see her leaving.
Right.
So too late. Sorry. Okay. So I assume you all can read, so I'm not going through the memo, but it's kind of giving what we think will happen next year in terms of activity based on council needs and the past surveys that we've done with members on what things they're interested in. As always, it's fluid because things will come up throughout the year. But does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? It'll probably come back to us for approval next time. I see a thumbs up, another thumbs up, another, okay, we're good. Anybody have a no, they're upset about it? Speak now. Okay, we still have time to discuss. If something comes to mind, you can email Deb and we can talk about it when we approve it next time. Thank you everybody for your participation, and thank you for your candor. I really appreciate when people say what's on their minds, because that's why we're here. So
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Yes, for next year, with the budget deficits in the state, how is that going to affect the Met Council and the LUAC or something like that? I'd like to hear something about that next year when budgets at the states are confirmed.
Okay.
I hear they're going to cut our pay in half.
Oh. Well, I hear they're going to tax it then too, so there we go.
And whether we have it in a meeting or just send it out for everybody so they have that information, we'll see how timing goes. But yeah, I'm sure staff is writing that down as we speak. So thank you, everybody. If there's no further business, Deb, did you have any other announcements or anything?
No, we're good.
Okay, then with no further business to come before the committee, we are adjourned. Thank you very much for your participation.